After years of hard work, my boss fired me over a minor mistake, but I turned his life into a nightmare he'll never forget. The first time I covered for Brian Keller, it felt like no big deal. Just a quick edit to a quarterly report, moving some numbers from one column to another, make it look better for the board meeting, he'd said with that trademark wink that made everyone at Meridian Solutions feel like they were part of something special. I was 27 then, barely 3 months into my accounting job, and dizzy with gratitude for the opportunity. I didn't know that moment would be the first brick in a prison I was building around myself. My name is Alex Mercer, and for 9 years, I was the man behind the man. Not that anyone would have described me that way. To the outside world, I was just Brian's loyal executive assistant, the quiet, efficient shadow who took notes in meetings and managed his calendar. What no one saw were the 3 a.m. phone calls when Brian needed a situation handled, or the countless hours spent reconstructing paper trails to hide his increasingly reckless decisions. "Alex, buddy, I need this to disappear," became his catchphrase. Always delivered with that disarming smile that had charmed investors out of millions. And I would make it disappear every time. From falsified environmental compliance reports to hidden harassment settlements, I became the janitor of Brian's moral disasters. Why did I do it? That's the question that haunted me later. The answer evolved over time. At first it was ambition. Brian Keller, the golden boy who had transformed a struggling regional consulting firm into Meridian Solutions, a $200 million company with offices in 4 states. Being in his inner circle meant something. I told myself I was learning, apprenticing under a master. Then, it was financial handcuffs. 6 months after I started covering for him, Brian called me into his corner office with its intimidating view of the Chicago skyline. "You're wasted in accounting," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "I want you working directly for me, executive assistant, double your current salary, plus bonuses." The amount he named would clear my student loans in 18 months. I'd be able to help my mother with her medical bills. And all I had to do was keep being helpful. Later, when the money wasn't enough to quiet my conscience, it became fear. By then, I knew too much, had participated in too much. The line between Brian's actions and my own had blurred beyond recognition. I wasn't just a witness anymore, I was an accomplice. "We're the same, you and me," Brian told me once, after I'd helped him doctor documents for an FDA submission. "We understand how the world really works." The comparison made me physically ill, but I smiled and nodded. By then, the mask had become my face. What made it all so confusing was that Brian wasn't a cartoon villain. He could be genuinely kind. When my mother's cancer returned and I needed to take unexpected time off, he not only approved it without question, but sent an enormous flower arrangement to her hospital room. When our receptionist's apartment burned down, Brian put her up in a hotel for a month. No strings attached. "People are complicated, Alex," he once said, after I'd questioned him about cutting corners on safety testing. "Even good people sometimes have to make hard choices. That's business." And I believed him, because it was easier than facing what we were really doing. Easier than admitting I had become someone I wouldn't have recognized a few years earlier. The company Christmas parties marked the years like rings on a tree. Each December, as the alcohol flowed and inhibitions faded, Brian would inevitably pull me into a side conversation, arms slung heavily across my shoulders. "This guy," he'd announced to whatever executive happened to be nearby, "is my secret weapon. Alex makes the impossible happen." Then, lowering his voice dramatically, "If I ever had to commit the perfect crime, he's the only one I'd trust to help me hide the body." Everyone would laugh, including me, but something in his eyes during those moments made me wonder if he was entirely joking. Meanwhile, as Brian's demands grew more audacious, a quiet part of me began to awaken. I started keeping records, meticulous, detailed records of everything he asked me to do. Not consciously for protection, at least that's what I told myself, but because organization was my nature. Every doctored invoice, every manipulated test result, every special arrangement with inspectors, all carefully documented and encrypted on drives that no one, not even Brian, knew existed. I also began noticing how Brian treated others. The pattern was clear: intense charm and generosity, while he needed you; ruthless disposal when he didn't. I watched him build up the marketing director, Sarah Chen, lavishing her with praise and perks, only to orchestrate her humiliating exit when she questioned his approach to a major campaign. The company attorney who refused to approve a dubious contract mysteriously found himself accused of expense account fraud and was gone within weeks. "You have to understand something fundamental about success," Brian told me over drinks after the attorney's departure. "There are two kinds of people in business: assets and obstacles. Assets help you get where you're going. Obstacles get removed." I nodded, smiling that empty professional smile that had become my specialty, while inside I wondered which category I fell into. Asset or obstacle? And what happened to those who were neither? Just the silent enablers, the complicit shadows. The answer came during my 9th year at Meridian, on an ordinary Tuesday in April. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to discover exactly what I was worth to Brian Keller, after nearly a decade of loyalty, after burying secrets that could have destroyed him a dozen times over, and his answer would change everything. Not just for me, but ultimately for him too. Because what Brian never realized, through all those years of dropping files on my desk with that conspiratorial "handle this command," was that I wasn't just making his problems disappear. I was storing them away. Every single one. And someday, when he least expected it, they would all come roaring back to life. The morning everything changed started like any other. I'd arrived early to prepare for the quarterly board presentation, triple-checking the slides Brian would present. The usual ritual of concealing unflattering truths behind impressive growth metrics and clever accounting. The financial tap dance I'd perfected over 9 years. My phone buzzed at 9:17 a.m. Mom's assisted living facility. "Mr. Mercer, there's been an incident. Your mother fell in the shower. The ambulance is taking her to Northwestern Memorial." The world tilted. Mom had been battling Parkinson's for years, each fall potentially catastrophic at 74. "I'll be right there," I said, already grabbing my jacket and laptop. I poked my head into Brian's office, where he was rehearsing his presentation. "Brian, my mother's had an accident. They've taken her to Northwestern. I need today?" Seriously? His eyes didn't leave the presentation on his screen. "The Westridge compliance package is due by 5. Their CFO specifically asked me about it yesterday." "I know. I'll handle it remotely. Everything's prepared. Just needs final review and submission." Brian sighed dramatically. "Fine. But that package has to be perfect and on time, Alex. Westridge accounts for 20% of our revenue." "It will be. I promise." The next 6 hours dissolved into a blur of hospital corridors, doctor consultations, and frantic work on my laptop during the brief moments. Mom was sleeping or undergoing tests. The diagnosis wasn't as bad as feared. No broken hip, just severe bruising and a mild concussion. But she was disoriented, clutching my hand with surprising strength, afraid I would leave. "I'm right here, Mom," I assured her repeatedly, while fielding emails and calls from my free hand. By 4:30 p.m., I was deep into finalizing the compliance documents, when a neurologist requested an urgent consultation about Mom's medication interactions. The conversation ran longer than expected, covering complicated adjustments to her treatment plan. When I returned to my laptop at 5:23, my stomach dropped. The deadline had passed. I immediately called Brian straight to voicemail. I sent the completed package anyway at 5:46 p.m., with a profuse apology email to Westridge's compliance officer. To my relief, she replied almost immediately, "No problem, Alex. Thanks for getting these over. Hope everything's okay." Crisis averted, I thought. I stayed with Mom until she fell asleep around 9, then drove home, exhausted but relieved. The text from Brian came at 11:37 p.m. "My office, 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow." I knew that tone, even in text form. I'd seen what happened to others who disappointed Brian Keller. Still, I never imagined, not after 9 years, not after everything I'd done, that I'd be on the receiving end. When I arrived the next morning, I found not just Brian but the entire executive committee and Grace Wong from HR waiting in the conference room. 12 faces, all wearing the same grim expression. Something cold settled in my chest. This wasn't a discussion. This was an execution. Brian didn't waste time. Yesterday, Meridian Solutions failed to deliver critical compliance documentation to our largest client by the contracted deadline. A simple responsibility, a non-negotiable timeline. His voice was calm, rehearsed. Alex was entrusted with this task and chose to prioritize his personal matters over this company's contractual obligations. I felt blood rush to my face. My mother was in the hospital. I submitted the package less than an hour late, and Westridge confirmed it wasn't an issue. Brian's smile never reached his eyes. Whether Westridge chooses to enforce their contractual rights is irrelevant. The point is, you failed. And this comes after multiple occasions where your performance has raised concerns. Multiple occasions? In 9 years I'd never received anything but stellar reviews. For the next 15 minutes Brian systematically dismantled my career, inventing a fictional pattern of errors and attitude problems. With each fabricated example, the other executives nodded solemnly, none meeting my eyes. They all knew this was theater. The decision has been made, Brian concluded. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Grace slid a folder across the table. 2 weeks severance, in exchange for signing the NDA and general release. Everything inside me went perfectly still. 9 years of loyalty, 9 years of protecting this man, covering his tracks, enabling his success, and this was how it ended. Over 46 minutes of tardiness during a family emergency. I looked around the table, recognizing faces I'd considered friends. People whose careers I'd helped build, whose mistakes I'd quietly fixed. Not one spoke in my defense. Finally, I met Brian's eyes directly. You know what's interesting, Brian? I've spent 9 years making your problems disappear, but my records of how I did it, those never disappeared. His expression flickered just for a heartbeat. Is that a threat? He asked, voice dangerously soft. No, I replied, standing up and leaving the folder untouched. It's a promise. As security escorted me out, I passed Diane from marketing in the hallway. Alex, what's happening? Career advancement, I said with strange calm. Just not the kind I expected. Walking into the bright spring morning, cardboard box in arms, I felt something crystallize inside me, a cold, clear purpose replacing shock and humiliation. For 9 years I'd protected Brian Keller from the consequences of his own actions. Now I would make sure those consequences found him, all at once. People often talk about hitting rock bottom as if it's the worst possible place to be. What they don't tell you is that rock bottom offers something precious, absolute clarity. With nothing left to lose, the fog of fear lifts. You see exactly what needs to be done. I spent the first 3 days after my firing in a daze. Answering mom's nurses' calls, mechanically applying for jobs I didn't want, and replaying that conference room scene on endless loop. On the 4th day I woke up at 3 a.m. with crystal clear purpose. Brian Keller had spent 9 years teaching me how to bury bodies. Now I would use those same skills to dig them all up. My apartment's spare bedroom became command central. I'd never been a particularly neat person, but organization had been essential for managing Brian's chaos. Now that trait served a new purpose. I began by cataloging everything I had. Thousands of files, emails, recordings, and notes meticulously sorted into categories on external drives even Brian didn't know existed. The scope was staggering, even to me. Financial fraud, nearly 200 instances of manipulated financial statements, tax evasion schemes, and fabricated projections shown to investors. Client deception, dozens of cases where Meridian knowingly delivered below specification work while billing premium rates. Environmental violations, particularly from our manufacturing clients, where Brian had directed me to help disguise waste disposal violations. Labor abuses, systematic wage theft, discrimination cover-ups, and wrongful terminations. Each individual incident might merit a fine or reprimand. Together, they painted a damning portrait of systematic corruption that could destroy not just Brian but Meridian itself. That last thought gave me pause. Meridian employed over 300 people, most innocent of Brian's schemes. Did they deserve to become collateral damage in my revenge? The question haunted me until I remembered the 12 silent faces at that conference table. The corruption went deeper than just Brian. Still, documents alone wouldn't be enough. I needed witnesses, people who could corroborate my evidence and add their own. I needed allies. I started with Diane Sharma, former marketing director, forced out 6 months ago after questioning Brian's decision to falsify effectiveness metrics for a major client campaign. Finding her wasn't difficult. She'd opened a small marketing consultancy across town. Getting her to meet me proved harder. Why would I waste an hour dredging up the past? She asked, when I finally reached her. Meridian is behind me. Because Brian's still doing it, I said simply. And because I can prove everything you suspected. We met at a small coffee shop far from Meridian's offices. Diane had changed the corporate polish, replaced by a more relaxed demeanor, but weariness remained in her eyes. You were his right hand, she said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. For years you helped him push people like me out. The accusation stung because it was true. I was, and now I'm going to bring him down for it. But I need your help. I slid my tablet across the table, showing her the file I'd prepared, documentation of how Brian had systematically undermined her, including emails where he'd instructed me to alter campaign metrics before she saw them. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through. I knew it, she whispered. I knew I wasn't crazy. By the time we finished our second coffee, Diane wasn't just on board. She'd given me 3 more names, former employees who'd left under similar circumstances, all potentially valuable allies. Michael Chen, former financial controller, had questioned Brian's creative accounting before being pushed into early retirement. He met me with initial skepticism that transformed into cold anger as I showed him evidence that his concerns had been valid all along. He made me doubt my own competence, Michael said, voice tight. Made me think I was losing my edge. Do you know what that does to someone after 30 years in finance? I did know. I'd been the instrument of that doubt, following Brian's instructions to gaslight Michael by altering reports after he'd reviewed them. I'm sorry, I told him, the words inadequate against the damage. But now you can help me make it right. Michael provided something invaluable: context for financial documents that would otherwise require forensic accountants to decode. This isn't just unethical, he said, pointing to one particularly creative bit of accounting. This is criminal. Wire fraud, at minimum. Each former employee led to others. Jessica Rivera from legal, who'd resigned rather than approved dubious contracts. Marco Williams from operations, fired after refusing to implement unsafe cost-cutting measures. Each carried their own piece of the puzzle, their own grievance against Brian Keller. But the most valuable ally emerged unexpectedly. I'd gone to clear out Mom's apartment. She was being moved to a more intensive care facility when I ran into Vanessa Keller at the elevator. Brian's ex-wife lived just 2 floors below my mother, something I'd always found awkwardly coincidental, but never mentioned to either of them. Alex, she said, genuinely warm despite everything. I heard what happened. It's Brian's pattern: build people up, then discard them when they show any humanity. Something in her tone hinted at deeper knowledge. We ended up talking for hours in her apartment, where she revealed the extent of what she knew, not just about Brian's business practices, but about offshore accounts, hidden assets, and tax schemes beyond anything in my records. Why tell me this? I asked, finally. Vanessa's smile held no warmth. Because when I left him, he made sure I got nothing. Claimed business losses that didn't exist. Hid assets I helped build. The prenup held because I couldn't prove his financial disclosures were fiction. She handed me a thumb drive. Maybe you can. 21 days after my firing, I had assembled enough evidence to destroy Brian Keller 10 times over. The question wasn't whether I could do it, but how to ensure the maximum impact with minimum chance of escape. The hammer was ready. Now I just needed to choose exactly where to strike. The art of destruction, I discovered, isn't about using maximum force. It's about finding precisely the right pressure points and applying steady, relentless pressure until the entire structure collapses under its own weight. If you go nuclear all at once, Brian will circle the wagons. Michael advised during our strategy session. He's survived scandals before by claiming persecution and rallying supporters. Michael's right, Diane added. Brian excels at crisis management when he can see the threat coming. So we devised something different, not a bomb but a slow-acting poison, administered in carefully timed doses that would steadily weaken Meridian's foundations, while Brian frantically patched holes that multiplied faster than he could address them. I began with something seemingly minor, an anonymous package to the Department of Labor, containing evidence of Meridian's systematic wage theft practices. Specifically, how junior consultants were classified as exempt employees to avoid overtime, while being assigned 80-hour workweeks. 2 weeks later, while that investigation was just beginning to percolate, I sent documentation about environmental violations to the EPA, focusing on how Meridian had helped 3 manufacturing clients conceal toxic waste disposal practices. Nothing directly linked to Brian yet, just enough to open official investigations. Then came carefully orchestrated leaks to trade publications, anonymous tips about questionable client practices that raised eyebrows in the industry. Nothing defamatory, just specific enough that reporters started making calls. Each move was calibrated to appear unrelated to the others, different types of issues coming from different directions. Meanwhile, I monitored Meridian closely through former colleagues who'd reached out after my firing, concerned about the increasingly tense atmosphere. "Brian's on warpath," texted Sandra from accounting. 3 emergency leadership meetings in 2 days. Perfect. Let him exhaust himself fighting scattered fires while remaining unaware of the inferno building beneath his feet. The first public crack appeared 6 weeks after my firing, when a mid-sized business journal published an investigation titled "Patterns of Concern at Meridian Solutions," highlighting client complaints about overbilling and under-delivery. The article didn't allege outright fraud, just raised questions about business practices that demanded answers. Brian responded predictably, a forceful statement dismissing the allegations as baseless claims from disgruntled former employees. Standard corporate damage control, executed flawlessly. He even appeared on a local business program, projecting absolute confidence while dismissing the unfounded rumors. I watched his performance from my apartment, admiring his practiced sincerity. Brian always excelled under pressure when he controlled the narrative. It made what came next all the sweeter. The next morning, Vanessa's information proved its worth when documents revealing Brian's hidden offshore accounts appeared on the desk of the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division, accompanied by evidence linking those accounts to specific instances of tax evasion. Simultaneously, the SEC received detailed documentation of misrepresentations made to investors during Meridian's last funding round. Still, nothing pointed to me. Different whistleblower packages, different methods of delivery, different agencies. The only common denominator was Brian Keller himself. "The constant drip is working," Jessica confirmed during our weekly check-in at a park far from Meridian's offices. Brian canceled the company retreat to deal with the temporary distractions. He's trying to project confidence, but behind closed doors he's becoming paranoid, demanding loyalty oaths from the executive team. "Any suspicion pointed toward you?" I asked. "None. He thinks it's a coordinated attack from competitors. Or possibly Vanessa, but not you. He told everyone you were too spineless to ever cause problems." His assessment stung, even now, but it also meant my strategy was working. The killing blow came from an unexpected direction. Among my files was documentation of how Brian had personally directed the falsification of safety data for medical equipment produced by a manufacturing client, potentially putting patients at risk. I'd hesitated to use this particular evidence, concerned about unintended consequences beyond Brian himself. But when I learned that Brian had started quietly selling his Meridian shares, while publicly reassuring employees about the company's strong position, my hesitation vanished. The safety data went to federal regulators, the client company, and 3 national news outlets, simultaneously. Within hours, the story exploded. Unlike financial improprieties or labor violations that could be dismissed as technical issues, endangering patient safety crossed a line that even Brian's most loyal defenders couldn't ignore. The client company's stock plummeted, class action attorneys began circling, and all evidence pointed directly to Brian's personal involvement. His response was desperate and clumsy, a hastily arranged press conference where he denied everything, blamed subordinates, and appeared visibly agitated when reporters asked specifically about his own emails directing the falsification. I'd made sure those emails featured prominently in the materials sent to journalists. "I never sent such communications," he insisted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool studio air. "These are obviously fabricated documents from someone with an agenda against this company." The reporter's response was devastating in its simplicity. "We've verified the email metadata with 3 independent digital forensics experts, Mr. Keller. Are you claiming they're all mistaken?" I watched Brian's composure crack on live television, just a moment of naked panic before the corporate mask returned. But that moment told viewers everything they needed to know. The next morning, Meridian's board announced Brian's temporary leave of absence, pending investigations. 3 major clients suspended their contracts. The stock dropped 31% in a single day. And still, no one suspected the quiet, unremarkable assistant who'd been so unceremoniously discarded 2 months earlier. The invisible man whom Brian had taught every trick of his trade, never considering those same skills might someday be turned against him. But my work wasn't finished. Not even close. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. What they don't mention is how intoxicating it is to watch that dish being consumed, bite by excruciating bite. Brian's temporary leave of absence lasted exactly 8 days before the board made it permanent. Not that it mattered by then, he was fighting on too many fronts to focus on Meridian anyway. The medical equipment safety scandal had triggered a Justice Department investigation. The IRS had frozen 3 of his personal accounts. 2 former clients had filed lawsuits alleging fraud. I tracked it all from the quiet of my new apartment, having moved to a different neighborhood partly for practical reasons, a shorter commute to Mom's care facility, and partly to distance myself from my old life. The walls of my home office were covered with printouts of news articles, regulatory filings, and legal documents, a macabre collage of a man's unraveling. "You should consider easing up," Michael suggested during one of our regular check-ins. "You've made your point, he's finished at Meridian." But finished at Meridian wasn't enough. Not after what he'd done, not just to me but to dozens of others who trusted him, not after 9 years of watching him escape consequences through charm and manipulation. "This isn't about making a point," I replied. "It's about justice." Brian's first major public appearance after his removal came 3 weeks later, a hastily arranged interview with a business network, known for softball questions. He appeared confident, rested, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "What we're seeing is a coordinated attack on a successful company," he told the sympathetic interviewer. "Competitors who couldn't beat us in the marketplace have resorted to regulatory harassment and media manipulation." He was good, devastatingly good at projecting wounded innocence while implying larger conspiracies at work. For a moment, watching him weave his narrative, I felt a flicker of doubt. Had I underestimated him again? Would he somehow emerge unscathed, perhaps even stronger, as he had from previous scandals? Then came the question I'd arranged, through an indirect contact at the network. "Mr. Keller, sources have provided us with an email where you specifically instructed your team to, and I quote, make these test results work regardless of what the actual data shows. Can you explain this apparent direction to falsify safety data?" The camera caught it all, the momentary widening of eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the slight hesitation before his practiced denial. I don't recall any such communication. And frankly, I question the authenticity of these supposed emails that keep emerging from unnamed sources. But the damage was done. The interviewer, sensing blood in the water, pressed harder. "We've had these emails authenticated by digital forensics experts. Are you suggesting they're fabricated?" Brian's mask slipped further. "What I'm suggesting is that there's clearly a campaign to discredit me using selective information taken out of context." By the interview's end, his carefully constructed narrative lay in ruins. The story was no longer about regulatory harassment, but about a CEO caught in obvious lies. Keller lies trended on social media within hours. 2 days later, authorities executed search warrants at both Meridian's headquarters and Brian's lakefront home. The images of agents carrying boxes of documents through the lobby of the building where I'd spent 9 years of my life evoked a strange, hollow feeling I couldn't quite name. Diane texted. "Watching the raid?" "Yes," I replied. "Feel good?" I considered the question. "Not good exactly, necessary." The following weeks brought a cascade of revelations as investigations deepened. Former colleagues called, some angry that my actions had endangered their livelihoods, others grateful that Brian's toxic leadership had been exposed. Meridian's stock, which had already fallen 31%, dropped another 42% before trading was temporarily suspended. But the most satisfying moment came unexpectedly. While I was visiting Mom at her care facility, a breaking news alert appeared on the waiting room television, Brian Keller being escorted from his home in handcuffs, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury as reporters shouted questions. An elderly man beside me looked up from his magazine. "Another crooked businessman," he remarked dismissively. "They always think they're untouchable." "Yes," I agreed quietly. They do. Later that evening, as I sorted through the day's developments, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Is this Alex Mercer? A woman's voice asked when I answered. Speaking. This is Special Agent Rivera, with the FBI's White Collar Crime Division. We'd like to talk to you about your former employment at Meridian Solutions. My pulse quickened. May I ask what this is regarding? We're investigating potential violations of federal laws by Brian Keller and others. Your name has come up in our investigation as someone who might have relevant information. Of course it had. I'd been careful, but not invisible. Somewhere in the mountain of evidence, my fingerprints remained, perhaps in document metadata, perhaps in the selection of materials that only someone in my position would know existed. I'm happy to cooperate, I said, projecting a calm I didn't feel. When would you like to meet? As I hung up, I stared at the wall of news clippings, my shrine to Brian's destruction. For the first time I wondered if I'd miscalculated. Had my need for justice become an obsession that would ultimately consume me too? But there was no turning back now. The machinery I'd set in motion had grown beyond my control, grinding forward with the inexorable force of justice. Or perhaps something darker masquerading as justice. The distinction felt increasingly blurred. The next morning, news broke that 3 Meridian executives had agreed to testify against Brian in exchange for immunity. His empire wasn't just crumbling, it was collapsing from within as former allies scrambled to save themselves. And I watched it all, feeling neither the satisfaction I'd expected nor the guilt I'd feared. Only a strange, quiet certainty that this was always how it would end. They say that living well is the best revenge. I disagree. The best revenge is watching your enemy's world collapse while knowing you caused it. But the question that follows is harder to answer. What happens after revenge? The FBI interview lasted 6 hours. I brought an attorney, Jessica's recommendation, who sat beside me as I carefully navigated between truth and self-preservation. Yes, I worked closely with Mr. Keller for 9 years. Yes, I was aware of certain irregular practices. No, I didn't maintain personal copies of company documents, half-truths and strategic omissions. I'd learned from the master after all. The agent seemed satisfied, though my attorney cautioned afterward that investigations this complex often circle back to previous witnesses. I left FBI headquarters with no guarantees, only the cold comfort that I wasn't their primary target. Brian's trial began 8 months after my firing. I wasn't called to testify. The prosecution had enough cooperating witnesses from Meridian's executive team, each desperately trying to minimize their own culpability. I attended anyway, sitting quietly in the back row watching Brian's shoulders grow increasingly hunched as former allies detailed his instructions to falsify documents, mislead regulators, and defraud clients. On the 4th day during a recess, our eyes met across the courtroom. For a moment I saw recognition flicker in his gaze, not just of me but of what I'd done. I held his stare until he looked away first. It was the closest I ever came to confronting him directly. It was enough. The verdict surprised no one. Guilty on 27 counts, the sentence 15 years with possibility of parole after 7, made headlines for a day before the world moved on to fresher scandals. Business publications wrote post-mortems on Meridian Solutions, analyzing how a once promising company had collapsed under the weight of its founder's hubris. None mentioned the quiet assistant whose meticulous evidence had triggered the investigations. My anonymity remained largely intact, my role known only to a handful of insiders. Meridian itself survived, barely. An investment group purchased its assets at bankruptcy auction, retained about 40% of the staff, and rebranded the company as Pinnacle Consulting. Several former colleagues found positions elsewhere in the industry. Others struggled. I felt occasional pangs of guilt about the collateral damage, but reminded myself that Meridian's collapse stemmed from Brian's actions, not mine. I had merely exposed what already existed. As for me, life took an unexpected turn, 3 weeks after the verdict, when I received a call from Eleanor Chen, founder of Horizon Analytics, a rising firm specializing in ethical AI applications for healthcare. Michael Chen speaks very highly of you, she said after introducing herself. Says you're brilliant with systems and uncompromising on ethics. I almost laughed at the latter part. After 9 years of compromise, uncompromising felt like someone else's description. Michael exaggerates. I replied cautiously. I don't think so. He told me how you helped expose criminal negligence at your previous company, despite personal risk. That's exactly the kind of integrity we value at Horizon. She offered me a position as compliance director, a role that would utilize my organizational skills while explicitly tasking me with ensuring the company adhered to ethical standards and regulatory requirements. Your job would be to keep us honest, Eleanor explained. Even when honesty is inconvenient. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of helping Brian circumvent rules, I would now be enforcing them. I accept. That was 14 months ago. Today, Horizon is thriving, recently securing major contracts with 3 hospital systems. My team of 6 compliance specialists reviews every project, flagging potential ethical concerns before implementation. Eleanor has publicly backed our decisions even when they've delayed launches or increased costs. Mom passed away peacefully 3 months ago. In her final weeks, as Parkinson's finally took its toll, she'd asked repeatedly about my new job, seeming to find comfort in hearing that I was helping make sure things are done right. Perhaps she sensed my need for redemption more than I did. I visit her grave weekly, placing fresh flowers and sitting in quiet reflection. Sometimes I think about Brian, now inmate M87302 at a minimum security federal prison in Pennsylvania. According to Michael, who still follows these things, Brian spends his days teaching business classes to fellow inmates. Even in prison, he's found an audience to charm. Occasionally I dream about the conference room where I was fired, but in these dreams I respond differently. Sometimes I walk out silently, dignity intact. Sometimes I expose Brian on the spot, watching his face as I reveal every document I've kept. Sometimes we simply have an honest conversation about why he betrayed me after 9 years of loyalty. I wake from these dreams not with anger but with a strange melancholy. The revenge I orchestrated was technically perfect, methodical, comprehensive, devastating. Yet the satisfaction it brought was fleeting, giving way to something more complex. Not regret exactly, but a sober recognition of what those 9 years with Brian had cost me. Last week, a junior compliance analyst questioned my decision to flag a potentially profitable project. It's not technically illegal, she argued. Just a gray area. Gray areas, I told her, are where integrity is tested. Not in obvious choices, but in justifications we make when no one's watching. She nodded, unconvinced but willing to trust my judgment. Later, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, remembering all the gray areas I'd navigated with Brian. All the compromises that seemed small until they weren't. Brian taught me many things during our 9 years together. How to identify vulnerabilities in systems and people, how to build plausible deniability into every questionable decision, how to make others complicit in your misconduct so they can't expose you without exposing themselves. But the most important lesson came through his betrayal rather than his mentorship. Never protect someone who wouldn't hesitate to destroy you. I carry that wisdom into each day at Horizon, into each decision to stand firm when pressure mounts to cut corners or look the other way. Not because I'm naturally virtuous, my role in Brian's downfall proves otherwise, but because I've seen firsthand how corruption hollows you from the inside until one day you look in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back. That's the surprising epilogue to my revenge story. In destroying Brian Keller, I found a path to reclaiming parts of myself I thought were lost forever. Not redemption. I'm too clear-eyed for such simplistic narratives, but perhaps something more valuable. The chance to choose differently this time around.